Hello, fifth graders. Thank you for taking time to come watch this video. This video is on lesson 7, or as we call it, Colonial Governments. And on this first picture I have here, this is referring to on the top here, colonial assemblies, and down here is the English and eventually British Parliament. And this here is representing a governor of any of the 13 colonies. So this lesson was focusing on the colonial governments. English kings had allowed the colonies to make their own laws because that's just something they gave them the power in the charters, which was a permission, basically a permission slip that said they could start a colony, and in a lot of those charters it says they could make their own laws. But all of those laws typically had to be approved by Parliament, and Parliament is a group over in England, eventually Great Britain, that was responsible for making laws for the country of Great Britain and all of her colonies around the world. Most colonies had an assembly, and it was the job of the colonial assembly to make laws for that colony. And the process that's involved in making laws, we call that legislation. So when you're creating legislation, you're creating laws. And this next part here, it says assemblies had the power to control a colony's taxes and spending. So taxes are the money that the colonists are paying to the government to do things for the colony. So basically have the colony run. So then the same assembly could decide, what do we spend that tax money on? Like nowadays, a state spends money on roads, schools, things like that. During colonial times, it was very limited on who could vote. Women, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and Native Americans could not vote or be a member of the assembly. Only white men that owned land could vote. Some colonies also required that white men also belong to a certain church to be able to vote. And that's the way it was with the Puritan towns, and especially Massachusetts Bay. If you wanted to vote, you had to belong to the Puritan church. But in all of the colonies, it was only white men that owned land had the right to vote. So colonists saw themselves as English citizens who had the right to make their own decisions, but their assemblies often fought with colonial governors. So each colony had a governor, so somebody that was in charge, just like we have governors in each state today. Those governors were picked either by the king, so you can see in this word appointed means picked by the king, or the colony's proprietor. The proprietor is the person that owns the colony, runs it like a business. Except for two of them, Connecticut and Rhode Island, they held elections to pick their governor. So those governors leaned a little bit more on the side of the colonists because that's who voted them in. Whereas the other 11 were definitely a little more loyal to Great Britain and their king. So when it comes to those laws, the governor had the power to reject. And that term we use to reject a law means veto. So if they didn't like a law that the assembly passed, they didn't agree with it for whatever reason, they could say, I veto that law. They reject it. And that term veto is still used today. In return, the assembly could stop paying the governor's expenses until their laws were approved. So remember, it was the assembly that was determined how many taxes were collected and what expenses were paid, so what they spent the money on. And if they didn't like something the governor was doing, they could say, okay, we're not going to pay for some of your things. This next one here, to solve problems, many male colonists held town meetings to discuss issues and make decisions to help make the colony better. Town meetings were things that we had talked about before when we had our lesson on the New England colonies, and they held those in those meeting houses. And just like today in this bottom one here, the colonies had local courts to settle disputes. So if people were having arguments with each other or disagreements, courts couldn't get involved to solve any of those problems. Courts would also answer questions about laws and determine if a law was broken. Judges were selected by the assembly and governor, very similar to the way we do it today. This is a term that we haven't talked about yet. It was not in any of your lessons that you read, so this is new today. This is the idea of solitary neglect. We talked about before all the ways that England was trying to make money off the colonies by having them pay taxes on goods. We called those taxes duties, limiting who they could trade with, things like that. But the king and parliament started to ignore the colonies. This time period we call solitary neglect. Solitary means something is by itself, just doing its own thing. Neglect means you ignore something. So the king and parliament said, all right, we're going to neglect the colonies and we're going to let them do their own thing. They stopped worrying about colonists smuggling goods in and out of the it says country, but it should be out of the colonies, and making sure the colonists paid all the shipping fees and taxes. All right, we're going to pretend none of that stuff is going on. We're not going to pay any attention to that, because they started to sense that the colonists were starting to get a little angry with them with all these taxes and things like that. So down here in the bottom, it says they did this because they realized that a war with France would eventually be needed to determine which European power had control in North America. The British knew that they would need the colonists as allies. And again, that's a term we've had before. Allies mean you're on the same side. So the British knew a war was coming, and they knew it was going to be with France. They didn't know when, but they knew it was coming. So they wanted to have the colonists happy with them. So when the war did start, the colonists would fight with them. So that's why they started using this idea of solitary neglect. They wanted to keep the colonists happy, basically. And a couple of things I just want to point out from the lesson. So just let me pull up the textbook here. This stuff was already in the notes, just understanding that John Locke believed that people had three rights that they should all be granted, and that was the right to life. So nobody should be killed or anything like that. You have the right to live freely, freedom, so make your own choices, and the right to own property. So those are three other things that he believed, and a lot of people agreed with. And you also read about freedom of the press. That's where they believed that the press, newspapers, basically only newspapers during this time period, had the right to print the truth, and they couldn't be stopped from printing the truth. Then you also read about Phyllis Wheatley, a freed slave that became a very famous poet. So thanks for taking time to watch this video, and have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye.